abortion, the fictitious phase of the zygote and the insignificance of a feeling. Here's the outline. I'll first talk about an ontology, existence, and its logic, how we think about what there is, and metaphysics of the person, especially how one's a person, forever a person, and necessarily a person in relation to ontology, because personhood, identity, the important thing is there's someone that's not a person, instead of being one. It constituted different agents, different identities. So, and then I'll bring in morality, well, to further explain my the metaphysics of personhood, and lastly, the ethics of how we treat the fictitious and how it all relates to abortion, because at the background, the discussion is whether, well, one way to approach the problem is whether a fetus is a person, right? And I approach that instead of from the biology or the only the biology or psychology. I think about simply from the morality point of view. So ontology, logic of existence. So here it is, some formality. So for any object, well, unicorn, Sherlock Holmes, and me, Ray, we can ask whether it's real or not. So it's real or not real. If it's not real, it's fictitious. And for that object in question, we can ask for any time whether it's concrete or not. Of course, I'm ignoring abstract object like the number one, but for object that has the difference in concreteness in terms of time. So a person that's concrete, a person embodied that plays a causal role in the world, interacts with the world through his body. That's when it's concrete. Of course, the person is no longer concrete when, even with the corpse not decomposed, the person no longer plays the causal role through interacting with the world through a living body. So, and given a certain object at a certain time, we can ask of a certain possibility of that object at a time, whether it's actual. For example, is it an actual possibility of me right now that I'd be in Beijing in 10 minutes? Well, I guess not, right? Because given the technology that we have right now, I couldn't have been there in 10 minutes. And especially with mere possibility, could I have been someone with alternative morality? Well, let me use another example, because so a lump of clay is an actual possibility of it to let it be spread out, right, at a certain time. It's also possible of it that it be made into a sculpture of me, but it didn't. So my sculpture is a mere possibility, well, given being made by a certain sculptor, especially if that sculpture has to be identified with its origin and a certain causal relation. So it's something that could have been something that could have been actual but not. And that's still, it's possible that that lump of clay constituted the sculpture. It could have constituted that, but it didn't. So that's mere possibility. Okay, so given those formalism at the background, when we think about what there is in the world, we conjecture what there is. We think about whether, so for some alchemists in the past, in the philosophy of science, we've been discussing phlogiston, right? A substance that turned out to be fictitious. And given that theorists have different theories about what there are, so using a predicate logic conception of object property relation, and to understand thinghood ontology using object property for something to be a thing, well, for something to have being, it has to be an object on instantiation property, and that is that relation is described using predicate logic. So in predicate logic, qualification domain, and with an unrestricted domain, if someone has a different ontology, people would be operating with different domains. So that's a variable domain, but in the end, I would bring out the ontological necessitarianism later on, because the variance in the end includes or maybe excluded some real objects. So that would have been a world that's not real, but let's say we conjectured something that's not real, not really there, so that's fictitious object. And the domain variation, given that we're talking about we're trying to understand the world, it's ontology. Sometimes we have a domain that includes too many things because some of them are fictitious, not real. And when we look at a certain thing, the fictitious object relative to us, given our evidence, well, is epistemically indistinguishable from the actual object, because, well, if we were to look at fire, and we hypothesized that there's some substance called phlogiston, whatever we're looking at when there's a fire, that, well, whether there is or there isn't the phlogiston, whether that's playing the causal role in the fire, whether that is phlogiston, given our evidence back then for the alchemist, it's indistinguishable. So phlogiston is a counterpart to, I don't know, to maybe to what plays that causal role, or maybe, well, it's up for this discussion whether what it is a counterpart to. But so that's one way to understand how we could have fantasied the existence of something without, of course, us knowing it, and that's an empiricism given a ontological necessitarianism, because that will simply be another necessary a posteriori, because it's a posteriori knowledge what there is, but given that the unrestricted domain includes all and only real objects. So that's a domain constants with an empiricism. That's how I understand how we think about what there is and how we do ontology. Okay, so so after having laid down the background, person. Here's something that I propose, that if someone is a person, then is necessarily a person because personhood is of a metaphysical necessity, and temporally of eternity, because once a person, always a person. That would have empowered our understanding of what it is when someone turned out to have chosen evil. Of course, later on I'll talk about morality and how it makes a difference to personhood through liability. So suppose someone in fact is a person, and given that a person is necessarily a person, he would have never lost that essence of personhood. So in an alternative world, he has chosen evil. So of course, actually, he is a person, and that alternative possibility is not a possibility of the person, but it is also possible of whatever they constituted the person, that it constituted something else. So it's not a person. It hasn't always been the way that it is. There's some illusion that it is a person, and that's something I'll talk about later on, which is at the heart of the issue, because that makes a difference to identity. Because, well, given that person and his identity, the necessity, metaphysical necessity of his personhood, and the metaphysical necessity of his identity and of his self identity. But had he been something else, then it's not a person with the original identity, right? So it clashes with the recent contemporary metaphysics, in which because I think even with metaphysical necessity and ontological necessitarianism, there's still something that's history dependent, and the interaction between history and metaphysics, well, there is, and given that something, especially ontology, what there is necessary. The interaction between these things are something that I'm trying to bring out in this talk. So okay, so someone that seems to be a person, because if he is a person, then eternally he is, necessarily he is, without us knowing yet whether someone is a person. There's an illusory personhood, well, because we are all embodied with a human body, human face, human hands and legs. So that's our human disguise. But once we discovered that what seems to be a person is indeed evil, without the personhood that it seems to have, that when we know that whoever that we thought is a person isn't, that discovery, the contrast the following, because merely possible person. So an egg that's not fertilized, well, it could have been fertilized, but it didn't. And had it been fertilized and having gone on, having been implanted and all the way up, being given birth to and having developed into a person, though, that's a real possibility. That's how the world could have been, but it didn't. So the person that the egg would have constituted is a mere possibility. So not a person. An embryo that's been aborted. Again, it could have constituted a person. It could have developed into a person, but no, it was aborted. So merely possible, and an irresponsible adult, that agent could have chosen a way of life, could have made different decisions and be responsible, be liable, be autonomous, be a person, but it chose not to be a person. So it could have been a person, but it isn't. So that's something very important, because if you discovered a possibility, an actuality, a situation in which that Homo sapien did something that's not what a person would do, then you would know that what seems to be personhood is a fake. Morality, of course, moral worth, worth of humanity, and that's something that I try to reverse the priority, because when we try to understand when it is that an embryo, a fetus, is a person, I go the other way. I think about personhood in terms of liability, self-liability, whether someone would own up to what one did, and of course, at the background, personhood, persons, human beings having evolved from earlier species. The very special feature of us is that we have free will, our agency, and the agency that made possible something that wasn't possible of animals, like thinking otherwise, doing otherwise. That's determined by past history, genetics, reinforcement, past reinforcement history, and past choices, and also perception, the environment through perception. It's underdetermined what one would have done given human free will. It's also underdetermined what one would think, right? Because of human free will. And with that possibility of having especially chosen oneself to be otherwise, we could have improved ourselves, perfecting our goodwill through self-respect. We could have done something that's that animals could not have done. So with the possibility of doing worse, we could have done better than animals. So personhood, I think even in the legal context, they're a unit of liability, right? So liability, persons are bearer of credit and blame, and they especially knowing that someone bears someone a unit of liability, that self-ownership, that one would own up to what one does. That's, I think, a necessary condition for being a person. And of course, there are psychological prerequisites, whether you can think about yourself, to form self-image, well, maybe, well, and certain kind of cognitive skills. And but that psychological prerequisite, what makes a difference, I think, is not only whether biologically a fetus constitutes some psychology, because what makes a difference is whether with the psychology, the fetus that's born, the infant, the children, the child, and the adult, whether it would have developed into a person with self-liability. So actuality. So given a born infant, through moral development, it would ideally it would have become autonomous, self-determining, that it will self-determine its value, that it's not relying on others' approval, that it would own up to what it is. It doesn't give up its own, well, personhood. It is a self-constituting system, that it is the way that it is because of its own decision. Of course, there are influences, parental, environmental, historical influences, cultural, of course, but then it's on each agent's own conscience that it owns up to one's own idiosyncrasy, because one way of learning to be an adult is to know that there are differences among all of us, and having been developed into a person, to have the self-liability, not only towards one's own action, but also towards what one has become. And that's the autonomy, being autonomous agent. There's an actuality of whether a certain infant would have developed thus. And given a certain child, that it would have achieved personhood in the future, then eternally, that's a person. Of course, at a certain time, epistemically, we wouldn't have known, and even the future is open. But, you know, the debate between foreknowledge and fatalism of free will, of course, it's still one's own choice that one would have become a person, even especially given a family with a good education. The parents would have known that their children will grow up to be someone moral, even though that's, again, the achievement of the child under the guidance of good parenting. So having said all that, there are pretended persons. They're not persons, but they pretend to be persons. They may look alike among us, but it's actually a self-misidentification, because they are not person, but they identify with a self that is the person, but that's because they are merely possibly persons. So the self that is the person is not their actual self. So that's, and of course, is in virtue of owning up to what one is, that one would have in the end achieved personhood and, you know, become human again. Having restored the humanity that one is supposed to have. And lastly, ethic, because there are some agents that are not really person, they're fictitiously so, fictitiously person, not really person, pretended to be person, even they pretended themselves to be person, among themselves, pretending themselves to be persons. So to think about unborn children in this way, because they could not, well, they did not in fact become person. So I understand abortion in the following way. So significance, feeling significance, because when, especially in care ethics, we talk about, we go beyond only rules and utility. We also think about sentiment, right? So suppose one of your elder relatives, like your grandma, she had a tough life, very difficult life. She tried her best. She earned her keeps, but then her life has been with so much obstacles that you know that her life could have been much happier. And when you think about that alternative past, that positive feeling that, well, that's a good thing, right, has a significance. because of her moral worth. She's someone real, and her moral worth is real, and someone with moral worth leading a happy life adds value and the positive feeling towards that better state of the world in which someone you care about is better. It is a positive feeling with the corresponding significance. In contrast to work of fictions, novels, fictional characters, it may be a sad ending that's not a happy ending, and the alternative endings that's a happier one. Maybe you would also be happier that the protagonist is the way that he ended up to be, but that feeling contrasts the kind of feeling that you have, the fellow feeling that you have for someone that's real, because the fictional characters they're not real, and but of course the literary value when we read works of fiction, novels, it's because it through the work the author, the artist shared the humanity. We so of course the positive feeling we have for fictional characters, and even when that it is happy, he is Sherlock Holmes being happy, having solved some crime, maybe we would feel happy as well. But that positive feeling contrasts the one that we have towards a real possibility, a real alternative past of someone real having been happier. So that difference in significance, given the same, qualitatively, the same positive feeling, then here's how I understand abortion and the aborted feti. So it's an illusion that so a mother pregnant, woman that might not have turned out to be a mother is pregnant, and she thinks about the child once born would have a happy life, happy family, and that feeling towards that happy life is akin to the feeling one has towards the happy life of some fictional character. And here's how I explain my case. So because given the eventual abortion, it's only a mere possibility that the aborted fetus would became a person, because there's no actual development. It wasn't even born, right? No chance. The abortion is a decision by the woman to annihilate the potentiality of the fetus to become a person, to develop through infancy, childhood, into adulthood, and making responsible decisions, being someone that's one's own person. It doesn't have that opportunity. But then, given the decision that it wouldn't have become a person, so it's not a person that's been murdered. No, because it's not a person at all. It's just illusorily a person, fictitiously a person, and psychologically, yeah, given the maternal instinct, especially the biological relation to the fetus that could have given without the abortion, that could have become a person, the relation to that fictitious person, the face that the mother, the woman imagines of the child that could have been, that's not a real face. It's just a face of something fictitiously person. That's something that's merely possibly a person, because something merely possibly a person could have been not a person, but persons are necessarily persons, so that's not an actual person. So the maternal instinct for the fictitious persons and the psychology behind it, here's my take on this psychology of pregnancy, especially when one thinks about one's potential children in relation to one's deliberation in making the decision of abortion. So here's a summary. I talk about ontology, especially with the contrast between using variable domain to think about what's indeed a constant domain and how something could have disclosed itself as fictitious because of our ignorance that we thought that it is a certain thing, but in the end it isn't. And a metaphysical person to use the example that I'm interested here about abortion, how someone could have been a person but having made choices that in the end did not constitute its personhood, and how its necessity and eternity interact with the epistemology of others, right? And to give some, to substantiate my theory about, I talk about morality, humanity, respect, and also autonomy, being one's own person, self-ownership, in the end self-liability, owning up to what one does and also what one is, what one has become, the choices one made in the past, the importance of all that, and to understand personhood not only biologically, but with morality, through morality. And lastly, given the morality that underlies the metaphysical person, I propose the ethic of how we treat the fictitious. And thank you very much.